The other thing we've seen too, and this is replicated in some of the data that we're seeing coming out of the banks in relation to people paying off their mortgages and also increasing their personal savings, is we've seen this kind of context change in the post-GFC environment from spending to saving. So we've seen that reflected in our research about people talking a lot more about being as judicious as they can about credit card debt, about putting any extra money that they have into the mortgage, about being very careful about what they buy. The caveat to that is, of course, they're also spending a lot of money on travel. They're buying new iPads. They're doing all those kinds of things. So when they're prepared to open their wallet, they are. But the emotional framework around spending and saving has definitely changed. And like I said, we've seen that reflected in some of the data coming from banks, which I think I'm going to go to now. We've had Jim Tate, who's the CEO of Westpac, gave some evidence at a Senate committee talking about just the numbers of, just the amount of people paying off debt faster, and particularly particularly mortgage debt. And really, people are still feeling pretty much like the best place to put extra money is in the mortgage. That kind of belief in the return that you might get from a house and from property has remained reasonably solid, even though obviously the market has been flat to wobbly in some parts of Australia as well. Yeah.
I've seen all these things about the national savings rate going.
Yeah.
But then I've seen other things around the fact that it's only really about half the nation that's able to save. There's
Yes.
a lot who make ends meet and not save.
And yeah, we meet those people who really crawl to payday, and people who probably wouldn't have $2,000 unless they put it on the, wouldn't have $2,000 in savings to put to things. Absolutely, yeah.
So there's a mentality towards it. That people are actually able to do it. They're actually able to save.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a spectrum of some people who are who may not have been saving at all and perhaps putting stuff on the credit card, who've now changed their ways, and there are other people who would like to save but can't either, and that's not because they're spendthrifts, but because they're really on quite low wages, or it's less people. We find it's less people with permanent full-time jobs than people with unstable work. So people who are perhaps on a lot of contract work, or a number of different jobs that move around, shift work and so forth. And I think that one of the things that happens with those kinds of workers, or we find people who are kind of go through periods of unemployment, they get a new job and various other things, and so that there's that kind of sense of not being able to save because they don't have a kind of permanency of their employment. So we do meet people who are like that. But that kind of general message around caution around credit card debt and putting as much money as you possibly can into the house is something that's kind of more universal. So just one of the other things that we're seeing quite a bit, and I think is another factor in the extent to which people have remained pessimistic and cautious despite, in that post-GFC environment, despite the fact that we've done so well, is that they're quite focused on the global economy, and we're interested to see, when we do groups of all different types, the extent to which quite detailed discussions about what's happening in America and in the pig nations and so forth, about what might be happening in China in terms of possible slowdown there, are things that people talk about. Now, obviously, that's something that the media have become quite fixated on. The negativity of the media is something that they're kind of how excited, almost kind of how eager they are to report bad news stories, both locally and globally, is something that people recognise. I had a colleague who suggested that's because a lot of people in the media are losing their jobs, and so they're kind of feeling like they're a little bit concerned about job security and kind of perhaps more a bit interested in being pessimistic about the future because their jobs are being attacked. But yeah, that kind of focus on that global economy picture is a big part of how, really infects how they feel about the local economy. And when we talked to clients previously about what might be the game changers in terms of consumer sentiment, we always kind of talk about political leadership, global economy, and job security as kind of the three top ones. They kind of the cost of living stuff is, I've got to say, and I've read the whole, I've certainly gone through the whole Mackay archive, 35 years of reports, and Australians have never said, gosh, I don't have any cost of living worries, isn't it wonderful, food's so cheap, and it's all like, they're always talking about the cost of living going up, so we use a bit of a constant, although, you know, at certain times, cost of living in some areas sharply rises and it becomes a kind of temporary issue. But that kind of global economic picture is playing a role in how people are feeling about the domestic economy. Quite a bit of criticism about tax, and it's not just the carbon price, it's a whole range of other taxes. Again, like cost of living, quite a consistent thing, regardless, boom or bust, Australians complain about tax. This is a little bit new, and it's kind of like connected to the heights of the Australian dollar at the moment, which was again one of the Roger, I think the retired engineer, made a point about this in terms of the high Australian dollar. And so there's a lot of questions about, you know, Australia being expensive, but also how much the high Australian dollar is impacting our capacity to, our capacity to really be competitive in the region and really be a really an attractive place for business to invest. This is a relatively, I would say this is a relatively new one. It's been interesting to us again in the two and a half years after the GFC kind of first hit. We found that job security wasn't as much an issue as we thought it was going to be. And it wasn't at the top kind of 3 issues that people would bring up in our research. But we started to find last year it started to creep in, and of course this year with the focus of the media on, like I said, different stories about different kinds of companies closing down and so forth, we found it's crept up as an issue for people. And now I think going into 2013 there's going to be an expectation that the unemployment figure will go up. But for a lot of people, it's not just about losing their job, it's also about perhaps not having as much employment as they would like to have. If they're casual or they're part-time, they'd like to have more work than they have already. That general sense of how secure is my job and how long is it going to last, and maybe I'm not going to be able to get that pay rise, and maybe I'm going to have to work harder for less money as well. And finally, an echo of what I'd said previously about attitude and that being important. A recognition after all of this complaint that our lack of confidence and our view of the Australian economy may in fact be feeding back in on itself. But like I said, Australians are grasping around for an effective and convincing positive story about the future, and given the nature of political debate, both at the state and federal level, they're finding that scene very unattractive, very unappealing, and while it remains that way, while the global economy remains that way, and while these concerns about job insecurity remain that way, I think we might be going into a year with similar kinds of issues as we've seen for the last 12 months. That certainly was the dominant view in the research that we did in October.